This is lesson 2.4. In this lesson you will learn the rules of extrusions. You will learn the rules of multiple extrusions. You will learn how to create a complex model by breaking it up into parts. You will learn how to control 3D viewing, and you will learn how to place and control a simple light. Back to Vectorworks. Open your exercise file for lesson 2.4. If you've forgotten where to get your exercise files from, remember it is the first lesson. There's a download link on the course for the first lesson for downloading your movies. If you've forgotten, there's a link on the very first lesson for downloading all the exercise files. We're going to talk about extrusions. So there are three basic rules that I teach for extrusions. Rule number 1, extrusions are perpendicular to the working plane of the object. Number 2, we can edit the extrusion object, so we can change the shape of the original object. And rule number 3, we can make all the changes we need on the object info palette. I've got an object here that I want to use later on, but first of all we'll start by going back to a top plan view. So we'll go top plan, and I'd like to create a rectangle. And I'll need a couple of these rectangles, so I'm just going to change my mode so I've got a couple of rectangles. And I want them to all be about the same size, so create 3 rectangles about the same size. Select the first rectangle and go over to your object info palette, and we'll make that on the screen plane. Now if we just refresh our memory, when we use screen plane and we use our flyover tool, so I've got my control key plus my mouse wheel button, and you'll notice that when I make that change, these layer plane objects, they rotate on the plane, but the screen plane object doesn't, because it's like it's stuck to my screen. So let's talk about rule number 1. When you extrude an object, it extrudes perpendicular to the plane of the object. So I've just gone back to a top plane view. I've just had a keyboard shortcut, which is key 0 on my numeric keypad. So I'm going to change this one as well, also to the screen plane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude this object, and we'll see that the extrusion comes out of the screen at me. So model on the menu bar, let's extrude, and we'll extrude this by about 6 feet. About 2 meters. So 6 feet. Now let's change our view. I'm just going to use my mouse wheel, just turn that around, and you can see that my object was perpendicular to the screen it went up. Let's change to a front view. Still a screen plane object. Let's extrude that as well. Let's go to model on the menu bar, and we'll choose extrude. Again 6 feet. So when we turn our view around, you'll notice that this object here was perpendicular to the plane of the object. It went up. This one here was perpendicular to the plane of the object, and it came out towards me. If I go back to a top view, you'll see what I mean by my rules. So rule number 1 was that extrusions are always perpendicular to the plane of the object. So we did this in plan, we did this in front view. Rule number 2, I should have said, was that extrusions always start at 0 on the working plane. So this one started at the ground, this one started on the screen plane at 0 and it came towards us. And this one, I'm going to change the view. Now you might notice here I've changed the view quite a lot. This is on a layer plane. When I extrude that one, so model on the menu bar, extrude, also by 6 feet, you'll notice that that one went perpendicular to the plane of the object and it went directly up. And again, they always start at 0 on the working plane. So let's just change back to a isometric view. We'll fit to objects. So how does this work in reality? So let's start by making some rectangles. Now you might remember we have this ability to have automatic working planes. So if I create a rectangle there, and then I pull that out, the object was on that working plane. So Vectorworks detected that working plane, so that's the plane of the object. It comes out perpendicular to that, and it starts at 0 on the working plane, so it starts there on the working plane. We can draw on this one as well. Pull that out. We can draw on this face, and we can pull that out as well. So these are really quick ways of creating your extrusions. So rule number 1, extrusions are always perpendicular to the plane of the object. So if you draw your object on the right plane, using either the working plane, the automatic working plane, or the screen plane, you will always get the extrusion that you want. Let's just draw another shape. So we've talked about rule number 1, we've talked about rule number 2, the starting at 0 on the working plane. The other thing I'd like to look at is once we've created an extrusion, we can double click on it. Now I'm in wireframe at the moment. If I change to a normal perspective and I change to OpenGL, now if I change back to top plan and then a 3D view, I was hoping that it would change. I'll just physically change that. So if it's in rendered view like this, I can double click anywhere on that object and I will be able to edit the original shape. If we're in a wireframe view, you will have to double click on the edge. Double clicking in the middle will not select the object. Just look at my cursor. We went through this in lesson 1. Vectorworks can see my object there, it can't see it there. So when I double click, there we are, you can see the original shape used to create the extrusion. So if I make a change to that, so for example, we'll get a circle, we'll draw a circle on there, and straight away that updates my object. If I select all of that, right click and go add surface, you can see it's changed my extrusion. In the background, this grey shape, that's my extrusion updating. So what this means is that you can create an object to start with, even though you don't know the shape completely, you're not totally convinced about the shape you want to extrude, but you can go ahead and do it anyway. You can extrude it anyway, and then what you can do is later on change the shape of the extrusion by doing what I've just shown you. So we're going to select all of that and delete it. Now there's an object that I'd like you to create. Now here's one I've made earlier. Let's just have a look at this one. So we're going to make this object here. I call it my cafe table. Let's just turn our view around. Now every time I use the flyover, it's just the control key and my middle mouse wheel button, and I just push the mouse wheel in and I can fly around. Now this shape's a little bit complex. It's got a top shape here, then it's got this tapered shape, and then it's got another piece at the bottom, a foot at the bottom. And so you can think of these as being separate objects. In fact, I've created them as separate objects because that's the easiest way to create those in Vectorworks. I know you might think that you should create all of this in one go, but that's not the easy way to model. The easy way to model is to create a little bit at a time and then add them together. So let's go back to your lesson 2.4. This is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to double click on your rectangle tool. I'd like you to create a shape which is about 14 inches, 450 millimeters. So 14 inches that way, 14 inches that way, at 0, 0, OK. Now just before you click OK, why do I make the foot at 0, 0? Well, I do that because it makes it easy for me to build up my objects. If I know that the center of my objects is 0, 0, it's very easy to use mathematics to build up my entire object. Let's double click on my rectangle tool again. This time I want one which is just 4 inches by 4 inches, so 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters. Okay, so I got my two objects. Now we looked at extrusions before and we had rules for extrusions. I'm going to use a multiple extrude this time. Now a multiple extrude is different from just selecting those two things and extruding. I'll do that to show you the difference. When I go extrude, you can see it extrudes those two things. They're just 4 inches high, and that's not what I want. So let's do multiple extrude. Multiple extrude goes between the bottom shape and the top shape. So if we just have a look here, we'll just fly around this, and it's a truncated pyramid. You can see that shape there. So what happens is Vectorworks makes the transition between the bottom shape and the top shape. How does it know which is the bottom? Well, it knows which is the bottom through the way that I created it first. You might remember when I created these, I created the bottom one first, and then I created the top one. Model, multiple extrude, and OK. Now let's do that again. So double click on the rectangle tool. This time it's a small rectangle, 4 inches by 4 inches. Double click again. This time it's 14 inches by 14 inches. And also at 0, 0. So you can see how easy it makes it doing that. So I've got one rectangle selected already. So I'll just select the other one. Now if it's tricky, select the first rectangle, then drag your cursor over the middle one. Remember what we learnt in Module 1, that you can select objects by dragging your marquee totally over them. and that will select them. So I've now got 2 rectangles. Now I haven't got the multiple extrusion selected, just my 2 rectangles. Back to model on the menu bar, and multiple extrude again. So let's make that 24 inches, about 600 millimeters, and OK. And you'll notice that it's sitting down here on the ground. So let's just turn our view and we'll have a look. There it is there, it's on the ground. There's our bottom Z there. We need to make that 4 inches or 100 millimeters. And so we've got one sitting on top of the other. So we've got 4 inches, 24 inches, and now what we can do is to make a rectangle for the tabletop. So we'll click on our rectangle tool. This time our rectangle is 29 inches, about 750 millimeters by 29 inches. So 750 by 750 millimeters, also at 0, 0. Click OK. We could just click on that and extrude that up because it's just a straight extrusion. 2 inches or 50 millimeters. Enter again. We need to lift the bottom Z. So we need to lift that up by 4 inches plus 24 inches. I could do the mental arithmetic, that should be 28 inches. Or if we're looking at the metric, it should be 100 millimeters plus 600 millimeters, so it should be 700 millimeters. So I should now have my tabletop sitting directly on my leg. And there it is. Let's change to a rendered view. So just here with a teapot, we'll change that to OpenGL. And I'm going to create another area just so that we can have something to cast a shadow on. So just an area like that. Model on the menu bar, extrude, -1 inch or minus 25 millimeters. Now when I change back to a rendered view like this, and I make that rendered with OpenGL, you'll notice there's no sunlight. There's no light here, so we don't actually get any shadow, no light. If we look at our OpenGL options, we looked at these previously, but let's make those very high. We'll draw the edges, we'll use shadows, but there is no shadow because there's no light source. How do we put in a light source? Well, I'm going to use my visualization tool set. That's this one here. We need a light bulb. And when I select the light, we can put in a directional light. And so it doesn't matter where you put the directional light. If you just double click, that will place a light. We're going to use soft shadows. It's going to, we better have a look at some of our specifications. It's a directional light. It's got soft shadows and OK. And there's our directional light, and now you can see the shadow. We turn our view, you can see the shadow. Now the directional light here has 2 dots. This one controls the elevation. This one controls the azimuth, or the angle of it. So that's the angle relative to north, and this is the elevation of the sun. So midday up here, early in the morning down here. This is the end of lesson 2.4. In this lesson you learned the rules of extrusions. You learned the rules of multiple extrusions. You learned how to create a complex model by breaking it up into parts. You learned how to control 3D viewing, and you learned how to place and control a simple light.